Hey everyone, this is Owen with Motion Array, and in this tutorial I'll show you how to make a map unfolding animation. In the animation there's some 3D layers happening with the way the map is unfolding, and then after it zooms in there's some really nice depth of field. Alright, let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the map image itself. I created the image using Google Maps. I zoomed in so it would have enough detail when I put my location pin down, and then I took several screenshots while panning around the area. I did this so I'd have plenty of resolution for my map so I could start far away and then zoom in. Once I got enough screenshots, I used Photoshop to stitch them together into one image using the photo merge feature. I then cropped out some of the extra stuff so that I had a perfect rectangle that was fully filled in. After that, it was good to go. The way you approach this step is up to you. You might not need to be as zoomed in as I made it, or you might even need to be more zoomed in. Either way, this is a quick and easy method to get a solid source image. So now that I've got my map ready, it's time to get into After Effects. So I'll go over to the project panel and double click to bring up the import dialog, and I'm going to select my map PSD and I'm going to import it as footage. Again, when this dialog pops up, I'm going to choose footage and hit OK. Then, with the map PSD in my project panel, I'm going to drag it over to the Create New Composition button. This creates a new composition, the exact dimensions of my footage. So if I zoom out now, you can see that it perfectly fills in. Now I'll desaturate my map image by going to Effect, Color Correction, Hue Saturation. In the Hue Saturation panel, I'm going to drag the master saturation down to -100, and that'll completely desaturate my image. The reason I'm going desaturated on this is so that my red location pin stands off on the black and white background. Now I'll rename my layer to Map Light 1. Then I'll duplicate it twice. I'm going to rename the second duplicate Map Dark 1, and I'm going to go to Effect, Color Correction, Curves. In the Curves panel, I'm going to drop the top control down just to give an overall darkness to the image. This is going to be the shadow side of the map, so that's what I'm creating here. Then I'll duplicate the dark map. So now I have 4 instances of my map, and that's because I'm going to break it up into 4 pieces, and that's going to be what's folding. Now I'll make a new solid by going to Layer, New, Solid. I want this solid to be exactly 1/4 of the width of my composition so that I can divide my map up evenly. To do that, I just need to click on the width value and then add a /4, and that'll divide that number by 4. So I'll hit OK, and you can see that it's created a solid that's exactly 1/4 of the width of the composition. I'm going to rename that solid to be Map Sliver 1, and I'm going to bring it all the way to the left side of my composition using the Align panel. Then I'm going to duplicate it 3 times, so I have 4 total pieces. The 4th piece I'm going to align all the way to the right side of the composition with my Align panel. And the 3rd one I'm just going to drag out a little bit, and same with the 2nd one. Then selecting all 4, I'm going to go to the Align panel again and do the horizontal distribute. So now they're all evenly distributed across my composition. Next, I'm going to use the pan behind tool and move the anchor points of each one of these slivers so that they're in the right spot for rotating. For the first sliver, I'm going to move it all the way to the right, and if I hold Command, it'll snap to the edge. I'm going to move my second one to the right as well, and the 3rd and 4th, I'm going to move to the left. Now I'm going to reorder my map layers so that they're each underneath one of the slivers, and I'm going to make sure that they're alternating as well, so I have a light and then a dark and then a light. Then I'm going to select all the map layers, and I'm going to set their track matte to alpha matte. That leaves me with an alternating version of the map with darkness and light, which is exactly what I'm looking for. I'll now make all these layers 3D by using the 3D toggle just to the left of the blending modes. And then I'm going to parent each one of the map layers to the sliver that it's right below. After I do that, I'm going to attach the first sliver to the second one, and the fourth one to the third one. So now when they rotate, they'll all be rotating together. If I pull up the rotation with R on the third sliver, you can see when I start rotating it, the fourth one is going with it. So now I'll start animating the Y rotation on all of these slivers to create my unfolding animation. I'm going to start with the fourth sliver and I'll pull up its rotation with R, and then I'll zoom into my timeline with plus on the keyboard. I'll move to 105 in my timeline, and that's where I'm going to set my first Y rotation keyframe. Then I'll move back 20 frames to frame 15, and I'll start changing the value to probably somewhere around negative 174 or so. Going back to frame 105, I'll place a keyframe on the third sliver's Y rotation. Then I'll go to frame 15 and I'll change the Y rotation to, let's see, 87. Scrolling down to my first sliver, I'm going to pull up its rotation and I'll do the same process. I'll start at 105, set a keyframe for Y rotation, then go to frame 15 and change the value to 174, just so it matches the other one. Then on the second sliver, I'll pull up its rotation, set a keyframe at 105, and go back to 15 and change its value to, looks like, negative 87. I'll move my playhead to about 2 seconds in the timeline and then hit N on the keyboard to bring in my work area so that when I preview, I can just see this small area. In my preview, you can see that the unfolding is already starting to take shape. I'm going to highlight all the keyframes I just set, and then I'm going to right-click on one and go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease, just to make this animation a little smoother. And then I'm going to right-click again and go to Keyframe Velocity, and for my incoming influence, I'm going to set that to be 90%, and for my outgoing, I'm going to set that to be 60%. And this is just going to make a stronger ease that's going to look a little bit nicer. So you can see in the preview, it's a little bit snappier now. The next thing I'll do is create the location pin. So I'm going to highlight all of my layers in my timeline with Command A, and then I'm going to twirl them back up just to clean up my timeline a little bit. Then I'll create a new layer by going up to Layer, New, Shape Layer. In that shape layer, I'm going to add an ellipse, and I'm also going to add a fill. I'll adjust the fill color to be a little less saturated and hit OK. Then I'm going to add a group as well. I'll drag the ellipse and the fill into that group, and I'll rename it Pin. Then I'll twirl down the pin and right-click on the ellipse path and convert to Bezier path. This turns the ellipse into an editable shape that I can change and make my own. So I'll zoom in and I'll select the path, and then I'll use the Convert Vertex tool under your pin menu, and I'm going to click on the bottom point. That's going to convert it so that it doesn't have any Bezier handles and it'll just be straight into that point. Then I'll use my main selection tool and I'll drag that point down to create our pin shape. Next, I'll select the contents in my shape layer and go to the Add menu and add another ellipse. I'll also add a fill, and I'll also add a group. I'll bring the ellipse and the fill into the group, and I'll drag that group above my pin. Then I'm going to change the fill color to white. I'll also go into my ellipse path and shrink the size so that it creates a nice little outline. Then I'll rename the shape layer to be Pin, and I'll make it 3D, and then twirl it up. Right now, my pin is parallel to my map layers, and I actually want it to be perpendicular. So I'm going to pull up its rotation with R, and I'm going to change the Y rotation, nope, not the Y rotation, the X rotation to negative 90 degrees. Then in my composition panel, I'm going to switch from one view to two views. In my second view over here, you'll see that it's in the left perspective. So if I highlight my pin layer, this is the side of it, and this purple line here is actually my map layers. Right now, my pen is getting cut in half by the map layers, so I'm going to change the Y value so that it's just above it. I'll pull up the pen's position with P on the keyboard, and I'll bring my playhead to 105, and then I'm going to set a keyframe. I'll move my playhead 10 frames down, and then I'll change my Z value so that it raises up above my map, so it falls into place. So right now it's animating backwards, so I'll highlight both of those keyframes I just set, and I'll right-click on one of the keyframes, go to Keyframe Assistant, Time Reverse Keyframes. Then that way it'll be going into place instead of flying away from it. I'm also going to right-click on the second keyframe and go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. Then I'll right-click on it again and go to Keyframe Velocity. For the incoming influence, I'll change that to 90 and hit OK. One thing I'm noticing is that the shadows on the map are still there even after it's flattened out. So to fix that, I'm going to animate my curves value that I added earlier. I'll start by going to the sliver right above it and hitting U on the keyboard to reveal its keyframes. So the unfolding stops happening right at 105, so that's where I want my darkness to be all the way gone. So I'll highlight my map dark layer, and I'll set a keyframe for my curves at maybe 10 frames before that. Then I'll bring my playhead back over to that last keyframe, and under my curves options, I'll hit reset. If I hit U on the keyboard now, you'll see that I have some keyframes set for my curves, and I'm going to ease those too. And then just with the second keyframe, I'm going to right click on it and go to Keyframe Velocity and change that incoming velocity influence to 90%. Then I'll highlight both of those keyframes and hit Command C to copy. I'll move my playhead to the first keyframe, and then I'll select my other map dark layer. If I hit Command V now, it'll paste those curves keyframes so that they'll both lighten up at the same time. I'm going to switch back to one view so we can RAM preview and see how it's looking. So it's looking good, but the darkness isn't fading quite as fast as I'd like it to, so I'm going to pull up the keyframes for both of the dark layers, and I'm going to highlight the first keyframe and just move it closer to the front part of that animation. Okay, I think that's looking a little bit better. So I'll select all the layers and I'll twirl them all up just to clean up my timeline again. Now I'm going to create a camera. So I'll go to Layer, New, Camera. All of these settings are good to go for me, so I'm going to hit OK. Next, I'm going to change the composition settings. If you remember, this composition is the exact size of the map image, and I really want it to be HD. So if I right-click in some empty space in my timeline, I can go to the composition settings. Then under preset, I can select HDTV 1080 2997. Then I'll hit OK. So now we're really cropped in, but I have a camera, so I can animate the camera to zoom in and out. But before I do that, I'm going to create a new Null Object by going to Layer, New, Null Object. I'll make it 3D, and I'm going to call it Cam Control. Then I'll parent the camera to it. I'll bring the playhead back to the beginning of my comp, and then I'm going to pull up the position of my camera with P on the keyboard. I'll adjust my Z position so that I can see the entire map. Then I'll drag the Y value down so that the map starts off screen. Once I get there, I'll set a keyframe. I'll then move my playhead to about frame 15, and I'll change that Y value back to 0. Next, I'll pull up the Cam Controls rotation with R on the keyboard and set a keyframe for the X rotation. I'll move my playhead 1 second ahead to 115, and then I'll set the X rotation value to 60 degrees. Then, using the camera's position, I'll start zooming in on the map. As I've zoomed in, I realize that my pen is now upside down, so I'm going to correct that by going to the pen's rotation and changing the Z rotation to 180 degrees. It's getting cut off a little bit, so I'm going to have to pull up its position and also adjust that. That looks good. Now my pin's just a little bit out of center, so I'm going to move my camera again a little bit more. That's looking good. So with these keyframes in place, I'm going to highlight the last two in the camera's position, and then I'm going to right click, go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. I'll right click one more time and go to Keyframe Velocity and set these percentages to 90 and 60%. I'm going to repeat that process for the X rotation on the cam control. When I ran preview now, things are looking pretty good. The one thing I'm noticing though is that my pen is sort of floating in space before it's even animating. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim this pen layer all the way to its first keyframe so it doesn't show up too early. Much better. Now I'll add the depth of field with the camera. If I highlight the camera and twirl it down, I can get to the camera options. Here I can change the aperture. If I change that to say 150, that's going to make a really shallow depth of field. In my preview, you can see that almost everything is blurry, so it's obviously not focused on the right spot. If I go into my two views, I'll have a better idea of where it's actually focusing. So with my camera highlighted, I can see where it's actually focusing by the end of that big triangle that's projecting out of it. So it's not exactly where I want it to be focused because I want it to be focused on my pen right here. In the camera options, there's focus distance, and if I just drag that value back, I can see it getting closer to my pen. And if I look in my camera view, you can see that it's nice and sharp now. So I'll switch back to one view, and I'll zoom out just a bit. So as the camera's done animating, I'm going to set a keyframe for the blur level at, let's say, 150% to give us a nice strong depth of field. Then I'll move the playhead back, say 15 frames, and I'll change that to 0%. I'll right click on the second frame and add an ease. That's looking pretty good, so now I'm going to add a spotlight so I can get some cast shadows. I'll do that by going to Layer, New, Light. I'm going to make sure it's a spotlight and the light color is good, and I just want to make sure that cast shadows is turned on, and these settings here for my shadow are good for me, so I'm going to hit OK. Immediately, you'll see that this does not look good, and that's because we need to tweak a few settings. To clean up my timeline, I'm going to select all with Command A and then twirl everything up. Then I'll select my pen layer and twirl down till I get to the material options. Here, I'm going to turn Accept Lights off and Cast Shadows on. And when I scrub through the timeline now, you'll see that it's casting a tiny shadow right below it. Next, I'll go into the material options for all of my map layers and turn Accept Lights off as well so that they don't get this crazy vignette going on. A shortcut to get to the material options is double tapping A on the keyboard. So I'll do that and I'll turn off Accept Lights on all four of these layers. Now I'll move my spotlight around so that I can get the shadow exactly how I want it. I think that's looking pretty good, but there is one problem. When I'm zoomed in, you'll notice that there's some cracks in the map, and that's where the seams are for the 3D layers. To fix that, what I'm going to do is I'll duplicate one of the map layers, and I'll turn the parenting off on it, and I'll also turn the track matte off. Then I'll drag it to the very bottom of the layer stack. Right away, you'll notice that there are no cracks, so that's good. But if I go to the beginning of the animation, you'll see that there's a flat map there the whole time, and that's not what I want. So what I'll do is I'll drag my playhead till the map becomes full screen. So right there is probably good, and then I'll trim this layer to start right there. Nice, so that eliminated those cracks. The last thing I'm going to do is add a background just to finish this whole thing up. Right now it's just on black, and that just doesn't look good. So I'll go to Layer, New, Solid. I'll make sure it's comp size, and I'll hit OK. Then I'll drag it to the bottom of the layer stack so it can be my background. Next, I'll go to Effect, Generate, Gradient Ramp. For the start color, I'm going to set it to be a light blue. And for my end color, I'm going to set it to be a darker version of that blue. Then I'm going to switch it from linear to radial and adjust the start of the ramp position and the end of the ramp's position. And I think that looks pretty darn good. Well, that concludes this tutorial. I hope you guys found it helpful. If you did, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more tutorials, go ahead and subscribe because we're making new ones all the time. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.